to liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the February 12, 2020 edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward, and I have the whole crew back with me tonight. Tina Stagg, Michael Abdullah, Angela Dugazia. We're all here from the Space Association. So let's get started with some Australian space news. Southern Launch is developing the world's largest privately operated rocket test range in South Australia. This is the second site to be developed by Southern Launch, which set up its headquarters in Adelaide in September 2018, shortly before the city secured the hosting rights for the Australian Space Agency. Southern Launch has previously been granted major project status for plans to build Australia's first commercial rocket launch site on the southern tip of the Eyre Peninsula south of Port Lincoln. The Coonibba Test Range will extend for 145 kilometres over the uninhabited national park and is located on Aboriginal land in South Australia's far west. The test range will be used as a trial location before launching rockets into orbit from the Whalers Way Orbital Launch Complex near Port Lincoln. The main difference between the company's two projects is the range. The Coonibba site is over a vast area of land, while at the Whalers Way complex, rockets will be sent out over the Great Australian Bight. Rockets launched from Coonibba will not reach orbit, but Southern Launch CEO Lloyd Damp said that because the test range was over land, it provided companies with the ability to recover their rockets and do further testing and systems validation. SpaceX has taken the first step to win approval to operate its Starlink system in Australia. The Australian Communications and Media Authority last month added SpaceX to the list of companies authorised to do business in Australia. However, SpaceX still needs to seek other authorisations, including obtaining a licence before it can offer broadband service in Australia. Australian company Foxtel said Starlink and another satellite constellation under development by Kepler could interfere with its TV broadcast services in the KU band. And over to New Zealand, Rocket Lab says 2020 will be the year of the satellite as the company rolls out its new spacecraft design. Rocket Lab CEO Peter Beck said the company expected to launch its first Photon small satellite in the second quarter on a test mission. Photon is a bus designed to host a wide range of payloads, and Beck said the company had seen interest in Photon from both government and commercial customers. The company, which is increasing the launch rate of its Electron rocket to 12 this year, said Photon would demonstrate that Rocket Lab was not just a launch company, but a more comprehensive space company. Rocket Lab is also working to eventually recover and reuse its first stages. And it's over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, space fans. Turning to US space policy news, and President Donald Trump mentioned both the Space Force and NASA's Artemis program in his State of the Union address last week. Trump noted the creation of the Space Force in last year's Defence Authorisation Bill, the first new branch of the armed forces established since the Air Force more than 70 years ago. He later asked Congress to fully fund NASA's Artemis program to return humans to the moon, saying the program was a launch pad to ensure that America is the first nation to plant its flag on Mars. Trump did not disclose how much the program would cost, although NASA's fiscal year 2021 budget request, which is due this week, was expected to have a cost estimate for Artemis. Reports last week said the administration was seeking $25.6 billion for the agency, an increase of 12%. To the International Space Station, and a Soyuz spacecraft successfully landed in Kazakhstan last week, returning 3 International Space Station crew members to Earth. The Soyuz MS-13 spacecraft landed nearly 3.5 hours after undocking from the station. It brought back to Earth NASA astronaut Christina Koch, who set a record for the longest spaceflight by a woman at 328 days. Also on the Soyuz were ESA astronaut Luca Parmitano and Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexander Skvortsov. To NASA's Commercial Crew program, and Boeing CST-100 Starliner had another software problem on its December test flight that could have led to a catastrophic failure. NASA's Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel revealed the issue at a meeting last week, saying the problem was caught in ground testing while the spacecraft was in orbit. Had it gone uncorrected, it would have caused erroneous thruster firings and uncontrolled motion when the spacecraft service module separated before re-entry, with the potential for a catastrophic spacecraft failure. Boeing said in a later statement that it was a valve mapping software issue, but claimed it was unclear what effect it would have had on the mission. The safety panel recommended a number of reviews of Boeing's software and validation efforts. And turning to NASA's lunar program, a NASA decision to withdraw a task order for its commercial lunar lander program has left companies puzzled. NASA informed companies that a part of the Commercial Lunar Payload Services program late last month it was withdrawing the task order, which requested proposals for a lunar lander mission similar to those it awarded last May to Astrobotic and Intuitive Machines. NASA gave no explanation for the move and has not provided those companies or others with any additional information. And over to Michael.
Thank you, Tina. A British company has started work on a satellite to provide communications services at the moon. Surrey Satellite Technology Limited, SSTL, has begun work on Lunar Pathfinder, a data relay satellite for lunar missions. SSTL is financing development of the satellite for launch in late 2022 and will sell communications services through a contract with the European Space Agency. And turning to Russia, Roscosmos is proposing to develop a version of its Soyuz 5 rocket for sea launch. The proposed Soyuz 7 rocket would be based on the Soyuz 5 but with less fueling, Roscosmos chief Dmitry Rogozin said. He didn't elaborate on specific design changes but said the Soyuz 7 would still have the same payload performance as the Soyuz 5 since it would launch on Sea Launch's floating platform closer to the equator. Rogozin didn't say when the Soyuz 7 would be ready, but the Soyuz 5 is not expected to enter service until the mid-2020s.
Over to SpaceX. SpaceX is gearing up for a suborbital test flight of its Starship vehicle. The company has filed an application with the FCC for communications during that launch, which will fly Starship to an altitude of 20 kilometres before landing back at the test site in southern Texas. SpaceX's application is for a 6-month window that begins on March 16. The company still has to obtain a commercial launch licence or experimental permit from the FAA, a process more difficult than an FCC licence. SpaceX updated its small sat rideshare program last week as it and similar services provide more competition to small launches. SpaceX released a payload users guide and opened an online booking service for small sats seeking rides on SpaceX Falcon 9 missions. The company says it's absolutely committed to the market, and other large launch service providers are also increasing their rideshare opportunities. SpaceX offers flights for as little as $1 million, putting pricing pressure on small launch vehicle developers. And SpaceX is considering spinning off its Starlink satellite broadband businesses into a publicly traded company. SpaceX President Gwynne Shotwell, speaking at an investment meeting last week, said Starlink is the right kind of business that we can go ahead and take public. SpaceX remains privately held with no plans for an initial public offering of stock, but a Starlink spin-off could be a way for SpaceX investors and employees to cash in on their stock. In other news, NASA awarded SpaceX a contract last week to launch an Earth science mission. SpaceX will launch the Plankton Aerosol Cloud Ocean Ecosystem, or PACE, spacecraft on a Falcon 9 in late 2022 under a contract valued at $80.4 million. PACE carries sensors to allow studies of phytoplankton in the ocean and measure properties of clouds, aerosols, and the ocean. Let's turn to Blue Origin. Blue Origin will test the engine for its Blue Moon lander at an Air Force Research Lab facility. A cooperative agreement will give the company access to a test facility at the Air Force Rocket Lab at Edwards Air Force Base. Blue Origin will make improvements to the facility to support tests of the BE-7 engine it is developing for Blue Moon. While the company started hot fire tests of the BE-7 last summer at the Marshall Space Flight Center, the Air Force site will enable engine tests in a simulated space-like environment. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Angelo, and let's look at Virgin Orbit. Small launch vehicle developer Virgin Orbit says it is weeks away from its first launch. The company's first Launcher 1 rocket is mated to its Boeing 747 aircraft at the Mojave Air and Spaceport for final tests, including a captive carry flight. Company CEO Dan Hart last week told the SmallSat Symposium in California that the launch should take place in the coming weeks. If the demonstration launch is successful, Hart said Virgin Orbit should be able to move quickly into operations with additional launches out of Mojave and also from Guam. Turning to Astrospace. Astrospace is planning a launch later this month. The company is scheduled to perform a launch from Kodiak, Alaska, as soon as February 21. Astrospace, which also goes by the name of Stealth Space Company, performed 2 test launches in 2018 from Kodiak that the FAA categorized as mishaps. The company is the sole remaining competitor in the DARPA Launch Challenge, a competition that will give it $12 million should it successfully perform this launch, and a second at another site to be determined. Astrospace has raised more than $100 million and has the goal of launching payloads of up to 200 kilograms into orbit for $1 million a launch on a daily basis. And over to Tina.
Thanks, Mike. And in Firefly Aerospace news, Firefly Aerospace said a fuel leak caused a fire during a static fire test last month. The fire, originally thought to be an explosion, prompted road closures and evacuations around the company's test site near Austin, Texas. The company said the fire was extinguished by a fire suppression system on the test stand, leaving both the stand and the stage being tested intact. Firefly is using the site to test its Alpha small launch vehicle, slated to make its first flight later this year. And back to Mike.
Thanks, Tina. Maxar Technologies has won a $142 million NASA contract to demonstrate in-space assembly using a robotic arm. The contract is for a project called Space Infrastructure Dexterous Robot, or SPIDER, that will be included on the Restore-L satellite servicing spacecraft that Maxar is building for NASA. SPIDER will demonstrate the in-orbit assembly of multiple antenna reflector dishes into one single reflector. The contract also funds a SPIDER demonstration with Tethers Unlimited's MakerSat to build a 10-metre boom in space and attach it to Restore-L. The mission is scheduled for launch in the mid-2020s. And over to Peter.
Thanks, Mike. And to wrap up this week, European astronomers have voiced their concerns about the impacts of satellite mega-constellations with the companies developing them. Astronomers met privately with representatives of OneWeb and SpaceX at the Royal Astronomical Society in London, a meeting participants called positive. Astronomers have raised concern that large satellite constellations could interfere with the optical and radio astronomy, with the bright appearance of Starlink satellites in the night sky being the best known example of such interference. OneWeb successfully launched its first large satellite batch of satellites last week. A Soyuz rocket lifted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome with a payload of 34 150-kilogram satellites. But some astronomers are contemplating action at an international court against constellations like Starlink. In a letter, one group of astronomers calls for a suit against SpaceX at the International Court of Justice, arguing that the interference Starlink satellites could have on astronomers would be in violation of the World Heritage Convention if access to the night sky is considered a shared human right. However, one legal expert said such a case would only have a slim chance of succeeding. And that's it for Space News this week. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tina, Angelo, and Mike. And we'll speak to you again next week. Bye now.